In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Christ is risen.
Isn't it indeed?
It is Farmer's Hours in the Americas on the Eastern Seaboard. This is the Terror of Demons morning show with co-host Kennedy Hall. How you doing, brother?
Living the dream. About you?
Living these dreams over here in America. We're doing okay. Enjoying the Midwestern springtime.
Yes.
Are you enjoying the what do you call that region? You don't call that the Midwest. You just call that
Southwestern Ontario.
Southwestern Ontario. Excellent. Wonderful. Well, welcome to the 4th week after Easter. We have a number of excellent saints. This week, we will be pleased to actually this Thursday, we're going to have another show. Kennedy and I will be interviewing the makers of this beautiful liturgical art, mainly the missus of that team makes the beautiful art. I think the Mr. does his supporting role, but this is the 4th Sunday after Easter. We have so this Thursday we'll be interviewing the makers of Liturgy of the Home. This is Liturgy of the Home, and we have today, in fact, is a wonderful historical tidbit that I discovered in my book, Kennedy. So today is a traditional French feast of the finding of the Holy Cross. Oh, it's an ancient feast that was suppressed in the 1962 calendar. It just got put together with the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, September 14th. Okay. So today we have Saint Helena, the finder of the Holy Cross. But May 3rd, so it's the finding of the Holy Cross if you have the Father Lassant's Missal, because that's the older rubric from 1945. But interestingly enough, do you know the story of Mehmed the Conqueror invading Italy in the 1400s?
I don't.
Okay, this is a great Italian story. So,
teach me about my culture, Tim.
Yeah, I will teach you about your culture because I'm an American. That's what I do. So Mehmet conquers Constantinople. You know that story. So there's the fall of Constantinople. He makes it to Italy with the help of traitor Italians like the Venetians, who are always seeking money and they're making alliances with the Turks. But he lands in Italy, and there is, I forgot the name of the town, but he takes over one of the Italian towns and he says, okay, now we're going to sacrifice 800. We're going to make an example of these 800 Italians. And one man, a tailor, I got to look up his name right now because everyone can look this up because it's awesome. He says, I will die 1,000 deaths for Christ. He says to the Mohammedan who says, we'll give you your prostitutes if you renounce Christ. And he says, I'll die 1,000 deaths for Christ. And then 800 Italian men rise up and they're martyred by Mehmet. So we're in the Italian peninsula. They've landed and they're about to just go conquesting. The entire Christendom is shaking for fear. The Pope is leading prayers. Everyone's praying. And suddenly God strikes him dead on May 3rd, the Feast of the Holy Cross in the month of Mary. He just dies. And that's it. That's the end of that threat.
How did he die? Do you know?
I don't know how he died, but he just died on this day. So right. That's the end of that whole threat. But it was as well as those martyrs in the Italian Peninsula.
It's amazing. Some of those, like the one that still gets me is how the Huns left They just went and talked to the Pope. And
Oh yeah, that's a great story. I love that story too. Saint
like
Leo the Great. Yeah.
I mean, if you read the story, if you read the history of their military abilities, especially in a pre-industrial age, it's unbelievable. Like the Mongols were. It's the stuff of legend. Literally, it's like legends that you would read in folklore, but they're real life. I mean, like 50-pound bows that they're holding while riding on horseback with no saddles and shooting. Like it's unbelievable what they could do, and they just left.
Absolutely, yeah. So Saint Antonio Primaldo, he was the one who rose up against Mehmet. So they took over the town of Otranto, is where they were. They killed 813 men, died for Christ in the Italian peninsula. After they landed it, this was in 1480. So, quick fun tidbit there. So we also have, speaking of the Mohammedans, we've got another big Mohammedan feast day this week, and that is St. Pius V. Mm-hmm. We have a wonderful artwork is great on here. We have St. Pius V praying to Our Lady of Guadalupe, with the ships.
That's a cool story.
Yeah, absolutely. Saint Stanislaus. Also a First Friday reminder. This Friday is a First Friday.
Yeah.
So if you're making your First Friday, or if you're doing the Crusade of Reparation, Eucharistic Reparation, great day to do that. Make an hour of Eucharistic adoration for reparation for sins against the Blessed Sacrament. So, without further ado, let's get into our show. We have a lot to cover, and we're going to try our best to get through it as fast as possible. There's just an insane amount of things going on at this time. The question posed by this show is, did Pius XI cause the current crisis in the church? This is the crucial period. Fatima began 1917, and asking for penance, asking for the consecration of Russia, asking for certain devotions to be restored or to be really introduced and spread as a means to avert World War II. Mm-hmm. And this is the whole premise of these apparitions, is that God is punishing the world with World War I, and there's going to be another worse war unless we repent, unless there's a consecration, unless all these things happen. So the question is, did Pius XI cause the current crisis in the church? So we'll try to get into all that. Now, I want to introduce, this is the first part of 8 more shows we're going to do.
Only 8, we promise.
Only 8 more. What part is it? 7 now? Fatima 7? So we've done all these shows trying to illustrate the context of these things with all this historical, and we're finally going to get into the debating of these controversial subjects. So what we're going to do here is we've identified 4 different controversies of Fatima. The first controversy is, did Pius XII do the consecration to Russia during World War II? And that will be the subject of next week's show. And on each of these debates, I will try to argue against whatever Kennedy says. I don't care what he says. I'm going to argue against it. So Kennedy works at the Fatima Center. So he supports whatever Fatima Center's
call it the consecration has not been done position.
Yeah. So that the viewpoint of Fatima Center on all these 4 controversies will be what Kennedy be supporting, and then I will be arguing on the opposite side of whatever that is. So next week will be Pius XII. So I will argue that Pius XII did the consecration of Russia, and then week after that we'll be doing more history. That'll be post-war World War II up to 1960, and then after that I will argue that there's a false Lucia. I will argue from that. That'll be the second controversy, the assertion that there's 2 Lucias. There was a imposter, basically. And then show after that, we'll talk about Vatican II and everything that's happened in the 60s and 70s, all these historical things. Then I will argue that John Paul II did the consecration to Russia in the 1980s. Kennedy will argue against me. And then after that, we'll bring it all the way up to the present day. And then I will finally argue that the third secret has been fully revealed, and Kennedy will argue that it has not. So those are the next 8 parts of this show. So
it's amazing.
Buckle in.
And today we'll see this as well. But Fatima, it's like the story of the 21st or the 20th century. You know, when you think about all the, that's why it's such a rich apparition. When you think about everything involved in it, which is probably why it's so, well, on the one, let's say the one side of the traditionalist leaning, who are trying to say, hey, there's kind of a problem here. You know, that's why they're so adamant about saying what they believe to be the truth about it. On the other hand, you find tons of resistance from the mainstream narrative in the church against anything to do with the so-called Fatima conspiracy. Real resistance, like really, really interesting stuff. And you know what? You know, it's probably because it's the most important event in the church's history recently, in the last probably couple hundred years, because everything that happened at Fatima, or everything surrounding Fatima, the context. I mean, look, we were able to do like 15 shows just trying to talk about what was going on around Fatima, because it encompasses all geopolitical maneuvers and et cetera. So it's a very big deal.
Absolutely. And there is a spectrum of, this is the one of the efforts of Meaning of Catholic, is to try to bring Catholics together to debate disputable topics.
Yeah.
Not things of the faith which cannot be disputed, and trying to distinguish between those things and say, hey, these are dogmas.
Yeah,
these are not open for discussion over here.
Yeah.
Even though the so-called liberal Catholics think those are up for discussion, they're not up for discussion. But we do want to debate and really get into all the things that we can dispute. And one of those things is Fatima, in certain senses of Fatima.
Yeah. And
we'll talk more about once we introduce the debate about in what sense can we sort of quote unquote dissent from Fatima? What are the, what's the authority of Fatima and private revelation, that type of thing. So we'll talk about that next week when we introduce the debate. But this week, we're going to continue talking about this period, which is the so-called interwar period. Now, it's basically, it's the opportunity from a Fatima perspective. It's the opportunity to repent, essentially, that God has given the world the opportunity to respond to the message of Fatima, to repent and do penance. But as we saw last week, talking about the first sexual revolution, there was anything but repentance being promoted by the two empires, which are the American Empire, which is a Masonic conspiracy, and the Soviet Empire, which is a Marxist conspiracy, both promoting the same thing, which is sexual revolution and feminism. Now, one thing that we forgot to mention, which is very, very important, because we talked about jazz, but perhaps maybe even more important, was the invention of the moving picture movies.
Yes.
And in the 1920s, believe it or not, there was pornography being created by Hollywood and being pushed on the American people. It was pornography. All right. And I'm not going to get into further details on what I mean by that, but pornography is the easiest way to describe it. It was pornography. So Hollywood starts producing pornography, and this shocks the conscience of American people, because most of them are religious, most of them are Protestant. There's a strong Catholic minority. The Protestants are so divided that they can't figure out how to deal with it. They can't challenge it. The Catholic Church alone is able to challenge the pornography of Hollywood, which is being produced throughout the world. And they organize a nationwide boycott of Hollywood movies, which are pornographic. And they're able to coerce and force Hollywood to make clean films. And this is what's called the Code era, the era of the Hollywood Code from approximately 1933, 35 to 1965. I call it the golden era of Hollywood. This is some of the greatest films were made during this time. Yeah. To this day, film critics, even academic film critics, believe that, for example, the movie Citizen Kane is one of the greatest films of all time that was made during this era. So this is proof that you don't need to make a bunch of pornography, whatever, artwork to make good art. You can have this cultural, this is basically Christendom. This is what you have in Christendom. You have a certain morals which are enforced by the people, which are enforced by the culture and even the government. But in this case, it was a purely private affair. So it was a private coercing through boycott. And this is the context of the destruction and the pornography that comes later. But then we have the crash of 1929, which is the entire, we didn't discuss this, but the entire 1920s, the Second Revolution was being promoted in America in particular, which was then being spread to all of the cities which were had a free economy, because we'll talk about how this was different in Italy in just a minute. But in the 1920s, there was a unlimited free loans, or loaning and investing in the stock market, which was completely unlimited. It wasn't exactly usury in the sense that classical sense of usury, but it was essentially just unhindered avarice in the market, where the bankers are just giving out bad loans because they're trying to get more money. And so they're lending everything to anybody to try to get more money. And then you have a crash because eventually that doesn't work, because it's just imaginary money. You just write some more numbers on a piece of paper and give it to somebody. That's not real money. It's not real assets.
And somebody calls in the interest. Somebody calls in the bond yield, et cetera.
And this is the situation. We're still in this situation. The exact same thing happened in 2008, which was an economic crash because there's bad loans, because bankers were trying to get more money. And we have the same situation now that the United States, they're just printing money and sending it to us. This is bound to fail. Anyhow, but there's a huge crash in 1929, which affects the entire world, insofar it is building its industry economically on these bad loans. Now it's very interesting because in places like Italy, there is no Great Depression, because in the 1920s, you went from all this quote unquote prosperity. People had all this quote unquote wealth, once again, quote unquote wealth. And what they mean by that is just having not a TV at this time, but having an automobile. Yeah. They call that wealth just because you have something and you have a greater convenience, but you actually don't own it because you're paying on loans forever on that thing. So you don't actually own it. You just have a certain convenience and you don't have a productive property. This is the definition of wealth that we've been trying to discuss a little bit, because the productive property of wealth is looked at differently in Italy. So tell us about what's going on in Italy. How is Italy not affected by the Great Depression? And you have bread lines and what all this poverty that's happening in the 1930s. You went from prosperity, quote unquote, to poverty in the Americas. How did that happen? And why is it different in Italy?
Well, basically, I mean, think about the countries that were belligerents in the First World War. Those countries had really industrialized prior to that, which is kind of why they could partake in the First World War, because it really was the first mechanized war all the way through. So Canada was a big player in World War One. Huge, actually. If you're a World War One history buff, the Canadian military was in there since day one, and a lot of battles and all that. And we industrialized really fast as a result. If you look at the history of the nations that were involved, it was obviously European nations that were industrializing, but it was also the new nations, Canada, United States, because we had the machines to do so. So along with that came a complete revolution in social life. The rural exodus, the mechanization of farms, moving out into the urban planning was the whole thing. I mean, very Marxist things. I mean, in a way, E. Michael Jones has talked about this with the whole Bauhaus sort of ethos behind how you make homes and neighborhoods and stuff. Basically, it's a way of life that's based upon having certain machines in order to do so. Actually, there's a gentleman on Twitter, Wrath of Non. I don't know who he is. That's his thing. He's a Catholic, but he's about 100,000 followers, and he's always putting stuff about urban planning and cities and traditional architecture and stuff. It was quite an interesting account. But anyway, Italy, Spain, Portugal, parts of France, most of Eastern Europe at that point was not fully industrialized at the time of the First World War. So those who partook, as I said, like parts of Eastern Europe, they industrialized real fast. And so places like Italy and stuff, they just weren't set up for that way of life, which means they didn't experience a massive economic shift in the same ways other people did, because they couldn't participate in the game. You can't participate in the game of international export and financing if you don't have the tools to play in that game. So they were still largely agrarian. Their family life and so forth hadn't changed as much. In places like Portugal, they were trying to get it to start changing, especially around the time of Fatima. The Freemasons were in charge and all that sort of thing. So Italy avoided that. They avoided the biggest crash because they also avoided the biggest type of boom. And same with Portugal was sort of similar, and Spain was as well. So in come these three guys: Mussolini, Salazar, and Franco, and they all come in. And Mussolini's the earliest, obviously coming around 1922 or so. And as we'll talk about today, his time as leader of Italy was almost the exact same reign as Pius XI, 1922, if I'm not mistaken, until 45 for Mussolini, until 39 for Pius XI. And Pius XII was very close to Mussolini under Pius XI. So there was a lot of relationship there anyway. So there was a continuity of leadership as far as that goes. But so Italy in the 1920s began to industrialize in a way that was much more organic with the traditional setup of Italy. And if you go to Italy today, you'll see that. It's kind of like Italy already had a civilization. They already had cities. They already had means of travel between places. So it wasn't as if it was like North America or the major industrializing places in Europe that had been destroyed. And they're rebuilding after World War I. So it's not as if you had these massive highways and things that were the basis of how a city worked. It was more like we already have a civilization. Let's add on top of that with industry as best as we can. So it really was a much more organic outgrowth. And even today, one of the problems when you go to Italy is traffic is always terrible because they still have their old road systems that they've tried to retrofit to have cars. You were going to say something though.
Oh, so would you say that this was an economic development in Italy that subordinate itself to the needs of the family?
Yes, I mean needs of the state, and then that's where when you talk about corporatism, fascism, communism, in the context of the 1920s, definitely needs of the state, but the concept of the needs of the state with Salazar, with Mussolini, with Franco was the family. So, There's think
the promotion of the family by the state. Have children.
That's what the state is the right. Families and the church and so forth. That's kind of, I love me some libertarians as far as being against the government that we have, but so often be like, anything for the state is wrong, and I'm like, well, I mean, again, that's a whole other conversation. But
it's just so much different when you think about the American Empire as this massive country that's 300 today. It's 300 million people, but I mean, even then, when you compare that with Italy, I mean, there's millions of people, obviously, but in terms of geography, it's a lot easier to have a corporatist state like that when you have a lot less people to deal with and smaller space.
Yeah.
It's doable, I think.
Mm-hmm. You also have a national identity. That's the thing.
Yeah, national. Yeah, there you go. Exactly. That is the key right there.
I mean, you say to somebody, we're gonna rally around being American. It's like, what does that mean? Now, but America's got more of that than Canada, though. You at least have a national myth. That's a big deal. I mean, for all the problems with the American Revolution in a moral sense, it's a story nonetheless that you can at least rally around. So that's still something. Anyway, so Italy was industrializing differently. So they did not experience the same crash. So during the 1930s, Italy was on the way up while most people were on the way down. And similar with Portugal, they started to go on the way up while everyone was on the way down. And Spain didn't have a massive involvement in World War I, if I'm not mistaken. But they did have a socialist revolution in the late 1920s, early 1930s.
Yeah, so they became a republic. I didn't look into this. So they became a republic. So just like the American Empire was promoting the destruction of all monarchy, as they have since 1776. So they're promoting the destruction of all the monarchies from Europe. Everybody's being imposed to have a republic. Mm-hmm. And we'll see in Spain in just a minute why that became a huge problem. Yeah. And the Spanish Civil War is really when the American Empire and the Soviet Empire become one, as they will in World War II again. But I wanted to mention, I've got China, Mexico, Portugal, Spain, France, and Germany that we should talk about. If we can get through all this, we touch on all of them. And Pius XI's reaction to these different things, what he does, and his reaction to Fatima, And I want to end with Germany because that leads us straight into World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound good to you?
Sure, but I also will mention.
Go ahead.
More context for Spain. The Western world. I mean, Latin America was under Spanish colonies for 300 years or whatever, 350 years. That all ended in the late 1800s, and a final blow was the Spanish-American War, 1898, basically over the Philippines. So there's a really short time frame between 1898 and like 1920, 1925, 1930. That's a generation. That's people alive under an empire and alive under a fallen empire. So it's the same. I mean, it's the same generation of people. So that Freemasonic, anti-monarchical push was massive in the Spanish Empire at the time. Yes. And they were reeling from a great fall, which was fertile breeding ground for revolution, which it always is. And in a way, if you kind of look at the history of Spain, it's almost like it was more difficult to control the spread of bad ideas all the way over there across the Atlantic. And so those things, there was a bunch of interchange between mainland Spain and New Spain, let's call it. And then there was a trickling down of ideas. And again, we'll talk about Mexico because we see the same thing happening again in fallen New Spain, which is now Republican Mexico. And
So in my book, I discuss how since the Monroe Doctrine in following the Holy Alliance 1815, the American Empire declares war basically on old Europe, on Christendom, and then declares war on the Christendom of the Americas.
Yes.
So the Spanish Christendom and the South American Christendom, they aren't able to conquer the French Christendom of Canada, thank God. So for the sake of all the souls,
they conquered themselves eventually.
Yeah, unfortunately, they conquered themselves later. But the American Empire has been dismantling the Christendom of the Americas all the way up to this point, which we didn't cover. But finally, as we said a few shows ago, the Cristero War is happening because the devil targets in this period. It targets the most Catholic areas, which are Mexico and Spain. That's the greatest. Concentration of the church in an integration of society and the people and everything is in Spain and Mexico. And that's where the devil has its greatest. Him and his fallen angels take the greatest efforts to try to destroy the church in both these areas, and they fail in both cases, of course, because you can't go against Our Lady of Guadalupe and not get stomped if you're the serpent. And then 1921. So basically, the errors of Russia are being spread throughout the world.
Yep.
And what I mean by that, first of all, is Soviet agents. Soviet agents are going everywhere. They're being spread everywhere. You have the Mao in China. He learns about the errors of Russia at his university. The Communist Party, CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is founded in 1921. Mao participates in his first communist revolution in 1927. And that's a prelude to 20 years later when the actual communist revolution happens in China and the modern Chinese communist empire is born that we're still dealing with. So that's China. And we kind of have to put that on the back burner because it doesn't really become prominent until after World War II. But then we have Mexico. So during this time, as we said, the communists and fallen angels are going after Lady of Guadalupe. The Cristero War is happening. This is the first big blunder of Pius XI, because Pius XI is, through influence once again of the American Empire, the American Empire engineers somewhat of a betrayal of the Cristero warriors, and Pius XI, through bad advice, because Pius XI seems to be a man of God by all accounts, but he seems to have suffered from bad. This has always been the problem since Pius X, maybe bad bureaucracy in the Vatican, as we know. There's all these bad actors in the Vatican. I think in Pius XI's reigns when we really start to see the bad actors show their cards in the Vatican, because they're really pushing for Pius XI against the Cristero Wars. And then later with Padre Pio as well, they get Padre Pio condemned because they convinced Pius XI that Padre Pio's not Padre Pio.
Bishop Williamson. I know he's controversial, but I was listening to him on a podcast the other day, and he has a very frank way of saying things in a very English way. And he said, and I won't do his accent, but he said, the popes have been really good. He says, Pius X was the best. And he goes, Pius XI was very strong, but not bright enough. And Pius XII was extremely bright, but not strong enough. That's just kind of how he summarized it. And what he meant by that was Pius XI was really strong. In like when he made it, that's one of the reasons why his blunders were real blunders, is because he made real decisions, which is actually prefer that to what we have now.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And Pius XI was a great pope. We're just talking about geopolitical maneuvers that were mistakes. Okay? And
and this happens with every pope. It's especially in this period where everything's changing every 10 years. There's insane revolutions. So it's I mean, Pius IX is a great example because he started off as a quote unquote liberal.
Mm-hmm. Even Leo XIII, they thought he was.
Yeah, Leo. And then he reversed. I mean, it's just a chaotic time, and popes are reversing each other, or they're changing. So we need to. I mean, most of all, we need to give all popes the judgment of charity and give them the best benefit of the doubt. Unless it's clear that they're bad actors, then we can say, well, they're maliciously trying to. But it seems that all these popes are really trying their best. So.
And Action Francais, we have to talk about this.
I was going to go Portugal, talk about Portugal consecration. Then we could talk about France. Mm-hmm. And then we'll get into the 30s with the Spanish Civil War and then Germany. Mm-hmm. So what happens in Portugal with Fatima? Tell us about that.
So after 1917, obviously, the apparitions are over, and then it's a local buzz about the apparition. The Freemasons were really ramping things up. Like, it was really bad. If you actually look at what was happening in Portugal at the time of Fatima, it was actually, I have two videos coming out the next couple of weeks for Fatima Center about Canada and my failed state that I now live in. And one of them is obviously very sad and negative, and one of them is hopeful, I hope. And so basically I go over the communist downfall of Canada, which is all about eugenics. And that's a whole, our healthcare system was started by eugenicists, population control, Freemason, all these kinds of things, as they tend to be. And that's led to the literal, you can find videos of Justin Trudeau talking about how much he loves the Chinese state because their dictatorship allows them to spin their economy on a dime, he said. So he just loves China. He's a communist, and he's an idiot. So he says these things out loud sometimes. He's a non-senile Joe Biden, let's put it that way. But Biden's probably smarter, which is saying a lot. In any case, Portugal was going through all this stuff. And it was to the point where priests were being arrested and so forth. I mean, the Freemasonic government was as bad as you can imagine, and it was getting very heated to the point. I mean, think about how disordered and insane you have to be to arrest children, as they did with the Fatima children, because they think they see, like, if you thought they were.
These 8-year-old, what are they? 8? I mean,
it was like 6, 7, and 9, or
they're
whatever.
A threat to the state. Let's arrest the children.
And it shows you how demonic Freemasonry is, because if you're just an agnostic or someone who believes children are telling fairy stories, you would just leave them alone. Unless you are a Freemason, and actually, when you look at what it means to be a Freemason, you are in a demonic cult. When you get to, I know a lot of guys, they join and they think it's about pizza and wings, and that's what they tell you, right? I mean, it's like you're going to ride little cars and raise money. But Freemasonry is a demonic religion, and when you get to the highest levels, you are in a demonic cult, and they know that, and they believe in the devil. They serve him, which is why they hate Our Lady. So you see that in Portugal. And it was ramping up in the time of revolution and so forth. Portugal was in a republic, and the church was being very suppressed. And then eventually, the devotion to Our Lady Fatima grows so much, it gets approved by the local bishop. And I don't remember where I read this. I listened to a sermon by, I think it was Father Ripperger, one of those guys. But apparently, a local bishop has a special charism. Even if he's not a very good bishop, he has a special charism to be able to discern whether or not an apparition is true. And you see this even with things like Medjugorje, where the bishop may or may not be that good, but bishop after bishop, 2 or 3 in a row, all said, no, this is not an apparition worthy of devotion and so forth. Anyway, so Portugal has Fatima, eventually 1931. you have the bishops of Portugal consecrate Portugal to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in the way that Our Lady requested, which is another part of the reason why we can say that it hasn't been done, because when it was done on a regional level, it had amazing fruit, which was a complete Catholic restoration in Portugal, like almost immediately under Antonio Salazar. It was bloodless. They did not have a civil war like Spain had, and when they took over the country, they didn't have a bloody counter rebellion, let's say. And you had a golden age in Portuguese society, both economically and What's his question here?
Yeah, Nuno says, hello, I'm Portuguese. I can tell you that in the First Republic, we had 42 governments in 16 years, so it was a complete mess.
Well, and that's like Italy. I mean, Italy, since, Italy has a prime minister and a president. I try to follow Italian politics. I don't know who either of them are half the time. I think they've had 50 and 50 years. Like, it's insane. Europe is not supposed to be republics. How much more evidence do we need? It's the entire time.
Yeah, so basically you have this push from the American Empire to make everybody republics, to basically undermine the existing culture of Europe and force on them this Americanized ideology of republics. And then you have a much stronger force of Soviet infiltration who wants to make all of these places into communist by violent means and killing people and bloodshed.
The Bolsheviks were actually setting up, this is, people don't realize, like, the Bolsheviks were actually setting up other parties, other Bolshevik parties. Like, so you would be in Spain and you would be, I'm in the Spanish Bolshevik party. It was an actual instantiation of communism that was popping up all over the world. I mean, it was an international movement. And if you look at how the communists work, they go in about 20-year cycles. And I did 2 videos for Fatima Center on this, on how their tactics work. It takes 15 to 20 years, basically. It's a process of demoralization, destabilization, and so forth. And they're very intentional about it. And they were doing it since day one, like since 1917 in Russia, since 1918, around there. And you see the crescendo of these infiltration and so forth in the 1930s.
Yeah, so right, the American Empire is imposing republicanism, which is sort of this effeminacy. Let's all just get along and we'll vote and it'll be great because the power to the people will just make decisions. So it's just sort of draining the masculine force out of the European cultures by this imposition of this political republicanism. And then this far more virulent and violent force comes in and starts destroying things. So then you have a reaction to that, and that's called fascism. Trying to counter the communists.
And one of the things, just from a hope perspective, one of the exorcists I was listening to once, he said demons don't actually work together. They're actually in competition with each other because they're ultimately selfish.
Yeah.
And one thing we see, this World War, this era is really, it's Marxism versus Freemasonry. So are they similar? Yeah, they are, but they are a little bit different. And they seek different means to enslave people. Freemasonry almost wants to enslave people by pleasure, and Marxism is by force. And although they, in a way, will work together, as we see in World War II with the Western Freemasonic powers allying with the Marxist powers, they still ultimately hate each other and want domination over each other. So you're seeing this play out in Europe. And in fact, there's a hypothesis I was reading last night, and basically they say Europe was in a civil war from 1936, which is the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, through the end of World War II. That was just basically a European civil war that was happening. So the counter reaction is fascism. And it's so hard to find good stuff to read on Salazar, Franco, and Mussolini. Shocker. I was thinking about this before.
English sources are probably pretty spare in that.
But you know what? You almost have to learn the language. Like, I was reading something last night, and it was talking about, Salazar in Portugal was a far-right movement where the impetus was the social encyclicals of Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno by the nationalist far-right extremist Salazar. And he sought to do things. And I'm like, it was anti-democratic. And
he was an extreme Catholic who was Catholic.
And he rejected the tenets of open free market capitalism. It's like, you're just describing a legend. Like, I don't know. You're just describing a guy who's super, anyway, so you just kind of, I was reading something, I'm like, if once you kind of learn the language, and you go, oh, I'm just going to read this as the opposite, you know. And it's like, oh, this is a great story. Anyway, this reaction was happening, and Salazar and Franco both of them explicitly. See, Mussolini was more controversial because he himself wasn't overtly pious, okay, or at least didn't express that. Obviously, he had personal life problems and so forth. He had a mistress and whatever. Whereas Franco and Salazar were known as being conservative, faithful Catholic men themselves. So they themselves explicitly, personally, were basing their society off of the calls of the popes with with Leo XIII and with Quadragesimo Anno. Was that Pius XI?
Yes.
Yeah. So basically, how to make a Catholic society, and Pius XI called Mussolini. He called him a gift of providence, a gift from God. He was a big fan, and Pius XII was a big fan of him as well. And when Franco eventually wins the war in Spain, they flew the flag of Franco in Rome. So there was a big relationship there, and it's interesting if you look back historically, because Quadragesimo Anno is basically 40 years after Rerum Novarum. If you think about it this way, Rerum Novarum is sort of the theory. It's the intellectual kernel of how can we have a Catholic society. 40 years later, Pius XI, who was a great pope overall, he's looking at, okay, these are the ideas. Here's what's happening in society. How will this play out? Mussolini's attempt was almost before it was like an attempt to instantiate these Catholic principles in a real practical sense in a fallen Christendom, basically. And Quadragesimo Anno almost is like a stamp of approval on that sort of governance, as much as people don't want to admit that, because with Salazar and with Franco in the early 1930s, they're explicitly saying we're basing it off of Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno.
Yeah, this is what gives the lie to any, and the reason why we're talking so much about fascism is that this is a crucial factor in Vatican II. Mm-hmm. As we'll see right after post-war. This is so important. That's why I read from Christopher Dawson last week. Christopher Dawson is the undisputed greatest historian, quote unquote, of the 20th century. And no one can basically say he's some kind of crazy fascist or whatever. And he himself says fascism is closer to the social encyclicals than liberalism or communism, either one of them. Yeah. And so he's the one who's saying, but the whole problem with fascism is simply that the state has so much power, and it is so easily abusing the church's rights. And part of this is understandable because the church later on with Franco is going to be actually promoting Marxism. So that's understandable to a degree. But at the other hand of the stick, if you have somebody like Mussolini who is not as pious as Franco, you can have an abuse of or militarism, as you said, invading Abyssinia or whatever. Also, just I have heard that Mussolini disallowed church groups and wanted only the state groups, things like that. So imposing the state's will on the church's influence on society. There's similarities when you look back to, like when you look back in the times of Charlemagne and men like that, the state was almost telling the church who to make as bishop. You do see this back and forth interplay of where is St. Paul. The state has a sword and so does the church. I mean, like the state legitimately authority is from God. So there is an aspect where providence will use the rightful authority, the natural authority of the state, to get the house in order. And you see in the 1920s and early 30s, in the Catholic countries, we're not Germany's different, but in the Catholic, we'll talk about we have so much more to get through. Okay. We'll try to. I want to touch on France really quickly because this is also such a massive step, and this is probably when we talked about Russia and Fatima, we'll talk about maybe Pius XI's greatest blunder, but this is maybe his second greatest blunder is the suppression of Action Française. We've discussed this in other shows, but essentially this is sort of the I mean, I view it as there's so many different forms of fascism that are trying to react against the communism. And I see Action Française as sort of that form of reaction to communism because it is
it's
Charles
integral.
Maurras.
Yeah.
Charles Maurras is an agnostic, but he's sort of promoting the church, basically. He's promoting Catholicism, he's promoting traditional values because he sees that. But the problem with Action Française is that it was flying under the banner of politics first, in the sense that we need to transform society by politics first, which that premise is the same premise as the communists and the American empire. That's the problem. So that you can see the problem with that. But so the bad advisors of Pius XI convinced him to suppress Action Française.
And
but
you see, under Pius X and Benedict XV, they had done an inquiry into Action Française. And the advisors to Pius X and Pius XV said you should be suppressing this, but they refused to, and they didn't act on it. Partly it's because maybe they just, to be honest, they died right around that time. But it was very contentious.
But the greatest Frenchmen of that era, the two greatest French churchmen of that era, who are Jacques Maritain and Gary Goulagrange, they both supported Action Française.
And Cardinal Bilot. Cardinal Bilot.
Oh, wait, was that the same Bilo as later?
Different.
Cardinal, okay, I was like, how could he?
He's someone that.
Okay.
He's someone that people. He resigned when they condemned. He resigned from the cardinalship, whatever you call it, when they condemned Action Française.
So
he was a hero against liberalism. He's one of those men that's forgotten, and he resigned because he was basically like, this is nonsense.
Right. So the difficulty, this is the difficulty of this period, is that should the church, I mean, this is basically what the church is saying now. The church is saying now, magisterium is saying now, well, we need to kumbaya with the UN. We need to kumbaya with the vaccine globalist big business, whatever, because we're going to build back better. Well, then they were saying, well, let's build back better with these. Okay, he's a secularist, but he's promoting Catholicism. He's promoting, all this good stuff. So let's work with him to try to work against the communists. So that's what they were saying then. And that was causing problems. But the main point about this, I want to read from, this is from biography of Marcel Leboeuf. This is from Fernand Tistia de la Meilleure. He says this on page, I had it, 49. He says this, because this is the key part about France. He says, the condemnation of Action Française was a turning point in the history of the church. From then on, the bishoprics were given to left-wing clerics, whilst all opposition to liberalism was falsely tarred with the same brush as Action Française. And so in France, because France sort of is the pulse of Europe, France is kind of what's cool for Europe. It's been that way for centuries. So what France does is kind of what other people think is cool. And that's kind of the way it influences society. And this is going to have a massive effect, because this is the book I recommend to viewers. It's The Avant-Garde Theological Generation by John Kirwan. And he talks about how there's this interplay between the theologians of this period in the 1920s and 30s in France. And there's arising this new generation of younger theologians. These are people like Henri de Lubac. At this period right here, this is where they're growing up and they're seeing this whole thing, that these are the people who are going to create Vatican II. And because of Action Française, this new generation, which also is mixing, I'm not saying Lubac is mixing with communists, but some of his friends may be, and that whole group is mixing with the communists in left-wing France. And they're the ones who then become the dominant force in France, especially after World War II. And so this suppression of Action Française is so critical, which brings us straight into Vatican II. And so that's why the question is, did Pius XI, and Colomb actually mentioned in one of his broadcasts that Pius XII, one of his first acts as Pope, Pius XII, was to reverse this. So it was well known that this may have been unjust or was a problem or all sorts of things. Pius XII immediately reverses it. So it's a serious blunder.
It's a big blunder. And Marcel Lefebvre's seminary professor, Father Lafloche, who was a big name amongst the intellectuals at the time, he was a great seminary professor at the French seminary in Rome. He was basically teaching the seminarians Action Française for as far as social teaching goes. And when they were condemned, it was like a tragedy. It was really was really a tragedy for the true understanding of the kingship of Christ.
Yeah, I believe Lewis, I believe this is a Frenchman right here, if I recall. You can correct me if you're not a Frenchman, but it says he's saying it's very different from the Contre la Revolution after this period.
Difficult.
So just going after and that's counter-revolution going back to 1789, of course.
And French integralism and so forth has been very fractured and split ever since. You have the Abbé de Nantes, who is the Catholic counter-revolution or whatever order he started. He's kind of a mixed figure, but he's very anti Society of St. Pius X, for example. Even though he says every exact same thing about, he almost goes further than Lefebvre about Vatican II and things like that. And then, of course, you have the Society of St. Pius X, which is really big in France, all things considered. And it's been a complete mess within French Catholicism. And we saw that trickle into Canada eventually, which actually it's interesting. After Action Française was condemned in France, there was similar movements in Quebec, but they weren't called Action Française. So nothing was condemned there. So you did see across the pond a glorious figure named Maurice Duplessis, who he called himself he wasn't a fascist because it was provincial politics in Canada, but he called himself Montanist, like they use that term Montanist, like a papal, whatever. And we see that happening across the pond. And Marcel Lefebvre was actually a big figure in Quebec in the 1950s and 60s. It's just, you can read old newspapers of him. Newspapers today, they're like reading, it's like reading the Washington Post. They're such rags, but it's like Le Devoir in Montreal, and there's op-eds by Lefebvre. It's very strange. But
there's a show we did with Colombe on French Catholicism in North America. It's I really enjoyed that show. Big bright spot from Pius XI is 1930 encyclical Casti Connubiu, in which he condemns the sexual revolution, he condemns feminism, he condemns the so-called emancipation of women as actually a slavery of women, as to his credit, Paul VI will also predict in 1968. Yeah. They understand that this is, and Leo XIII did the same thing in 1890 Arcanum. Mm-hmm. They understand that this false feminism is actually going to destroy woman. It's going to objectify her in an economy, as it already has been doing. And it's going to basically just burgeoning this terrible pornography plague, destroying women and children across the globe as this false feminism. So 1930 is a great encyclical. 1931, as you mentioned, Quadragesimo Anno, influenced by the great Heinrich Pesch, the German, which we'll get into Germany in a second, but we're trying to go as fast as we can here. But unfortunately, we have to go to the next big blunder, which is the greatest blunder of Pius XI, which is not consecrating Russia. Mm-hmm. And I've got, I want to put up here it is. Okay.
Timeline.
So here's the timeline. So we have fall of 1930. There's sufficient evidence that Pius XI knew of the request made by Jesus and Mary through Sister Lucia. He does nothing. So by 1930, it is quite clear that Pius XI was informed of this. To be fair, how many people per day, how many quote unquote visionaries does a pope receive every day thinking that Jesus talked to them? Okay, that's to be fair. Yep. It's easy to be skeptical. But on the other hand, we have a massive public miracle, which, as this timeline says, 1930, October 13, Bishop Jose Correa of Liria approves the Fatima apparition. So now it's been approved. So now it's just not just a next new visionary. So then we have 1931. Our Lord appears to the infirm Sister Lucia and tells her, quote, "Make it known to my ministers that given they follow the example of the King of France and delaying the execution of my command, they will follow him into misfortune." And this is, of course, the reference to the French Revolution, in which Louis the 14th and 15th were both asked. I think it was 14th originally who received the request, if I recall. Mm-hmm. Louis the 14th received the request from Saint Mary Lecoq to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. He didn't do it. Neither did his son. I think Louis the 16th was his grandson, if memory serves. But Louis the 16th finally does it, but it's too late, and the French Revolution happens.
It happened to the day as well.
To the day.
And like literally to the day of that initial request, that's when the upstart Third Estate took power away in a parliamentary fashion. And then 4 years later to the day, the king had his head chopped off. So there you go. And that's a 100-year. It's a 100-year window. So that's why the next few years are going to be a doozy, because that request was made in 1929 technically, and 1931 was 2 years after that had happened, but it was 2 years after the request was made, specifically how to do the consecration.
Yeah. So we'll get into this. Goes into our next debate actually, because there's a different perspective from the other side on that one. So we'll get into that debate next week. Stay tuned. But in any case, we know that Sister Lucia was requesting, and Pius XI was aware of it. We know that he must have been aware of it somehow. With all this, it's all been pressing upon him. And we're going to get into what's happening in Germany during this time in just a minute. So in 1936, timeline says, so 1935, Sister Lucia insists that the request of heaven must be heeded. 1936, she reiterates, it is necessary to insist that for our Lord, he wants the church to acknowledge that the consecration as a triumph of the Immaculate Heart and place its devotion beside the devotion to my Sacred Heart. Mm-hmm. We've got a formal letter, 1937. He receives a formal letter from Bishop Lira. He gives no response. And so we'll get back to this in just a minute when we talk about, because we got to talk about the Spanish Civil War. Because what happens in Germany, this is right before what I will assert that World War II happened in 1938, and I'll explain why. But this is 1937. So Pius XI does not do the consecration of Raja. Kennedy, do you have any speculation as to why do you think Pius XI did not do the consecration?
I don't know. The only thing I can say in general why the popes haven't done it in the way, like, listen, in the collegial sense of with the bishops, part of me thinks it's hard. Like, I know that sounds silly, but to have all the bishops around the world doing the same thing, there's a way to do it, but it requires a firm hand that is hard in our day. And basically, basically you'd have to say every bishop has to do this. I don't know, give it a time window, let's say at noon your time or something. And if you don't do it, you're late sententia excommunicated. I mean, that would be the only way you could basically ensure that everyone who is a bishop of the Catholic Church has done it, because if he hasn't done it, he's been excommunicated and is no longer under the, that sort of thing. That's kind of the only way you could make something like that happen. I think that's one of the big issues, is why it's been so hard to do, is that's a big deal. Anyway, so with everything going on, I mean, in the world at the time, bishops in places everywhere from Latin America to Quebec to the States to, what's it called? Vietnam. I mean, you've got all these places that are having massive social changes that are Catholic, and having all of them do a massive collegial consecration, I think, is just a big deal.
Yeah, Lowell, shout out to our Australian viewers. Lowell says, she's making a point, a very good point here, because there's so many. We talked about the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
We have to make an assumption that Pius XI did actually receive these letters.
Yep.
I'm not aware of him actually mentioning Fatima ever. He has a letter of, I believe there's a cyclical letter on the Rosary. I have to check the reference here, but he does mention sort of an implicit reference, I think. But to my knowledge, I've never heard of Pius XI actually mentioning Fatima in this sense. So we could also say, well, he never even got the letters. So very good point here thanks, Lowell.
Yep.
Okay, so we got to talk about the Spanish Civil War, and then we'll talk about what's happening in Germany and how this leads. But I wanted to mention, too, as well, the Soviets are continually, they're still destroying everything everywhere. Yeah. We have the Holodomor in 1933? Holodomor. Pardon my lack of pronunciation. So the terror famine of 1932, 1933, when the Soviets forcibly starved to death millions of Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. And this is what one of the many mass murders of Stalin and all of his henchmen leading up to World War II. And we really need to see this in context, because this is going to help us see World War II for what it really is, which in my book, I call World War II a mass murderer and his allies against a mass murderer and his Axis.
Yeah,
that's what I think we need to understand World War II as, because even today, people still think World War II was this glorious America versus Hitler and all this nonsense. I mean, they don't understand the complexity of the situation. It was a punishment from God, is what it was.
You really can see the infiltration of communists in academia when somehow you can say, well, communism, like you can say in a group of intelligent people, communism isn't bad, it just hasn't been tried properly. Imagine saying Nazism isn't bad, it just hasn't been tried properly.
Exactly. There you go.
Arguably,
arguably
the communists were worse. I mean, it's like
far worse. Yeah.
It's like
just in terms of bodies, because all they care about is just numbers.
Well, and not even just the bodies, but the things they expected of their people. You know, I mean, like they really. Anyway, it's insane what they did. It's when you read Solzhenitsyn, it's like you think it's too strange to be fiction.
Yep. And
you're thinking, I don't know how. Like it's unbelievably insane. No, just obviously the bodies, mass murder. Okay, both the Nazis and the communists did that. But on top of that, the way that they were trying to organize society, it was a complete upheaval from top to bottom.
Yep. So speaking of the communists, now we got to talk about Spanish Civil War, then we'll get into Germany. And this is where it gets really interesting, because so you have in your timeline here, Kennedy, the Spanish Revolution breaks out in 1931. Prime Minister Azana solemnly declares that the parliament, today Spain, has ceased to be Catholic. So as I understand it, the Soviets were funding the communist revolution, quote unquote, in Spain via the Republic. And this is important because in America, we are having a Biden revolution of unity here, which is a brave new world over here. And you've already had that decades ago, or whatever, in Canada, lamentably. So this is what happened in the Spanish Republic. It's a quote unquote democracy. So all the communists infiltrated, and they were able to push in their democracy to try to get more and more power for all these Soviet agents who are communists or Spanish. And so they're pushing for a communist revolution in Spain. And then finally, to break this long story way too short, finally war breaks out in Spain between the communists, who are known as the Republicans, I believe is the term, falsely ascribed to their group. The communists are falsely called the Republicans, who are fighting against the nationalists, who is Franco, and his important ally are the Carlists, who insist, the Carlists are the most faithful Catholic group in Spain for decades and decades. And they insist that this whole war be imbued with a crusading spirit. And they view it as a crusade. They view that this is a crusade against the fallen angels, because Spain, as we know, has led the fight against the fallen angels since Pelayo in the 700s. And this is, I'm told, shout out to Luis Medina over at Reconquista Radio. Luis told me that I was discussing this with him before I went on the show. He said that the Carlists were so imbued with the crusading spirit that they were giving their lives and their blood more and more and more than anyone else in this war. And they were willing to go and sacrifice and die on the battlefield to stop the communists. And as a result, they were so few in number after the Spanish Civil War. So they had been killed so much because they sacrificed so much in this war. And it's just one more Spanish crusade, which was a victory against the enemies of Christ. So this is one more glory of Spain in all the victories for Christ that Spain has conquered for Christ. So it is truly a glorious story. And there's many martyrs, many martyrs.
There were
of this period.
500 beatified under, I can't remember which pope. I was reading about it last night. But they were the martyrs. I mean, this was seen as, so a little bit of context for the Republicanos in Spain. When I did my Spanish degree, they were the heroes in our textbooks. And, we had an optional, I literally did a course called Spanish Civil War Era Poetry. talk about things we'll get.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned that
yeah
last week. Yeah.
It was very interesting. I mean, it was like the thing about these revolutionaries and communists and so forth. It's just like the same with it's the same thing they do with Hollywood, because they're sensualists and materialists. They make really attractive art in all forms that they do, because it's very human, right? In that sense, it's a fallen humanism. So it appeals to emotions and senses and things. And I remember reading some of it. It was a completely degenerate group of people. People, like, to get to the point where you can destabilize a nation, you have to corrupt their morals. It was extremely sexual. It was extremely degenerate in its sexuality. It was pornographic. Even the poetry was pornographic. I had to read some of the poetry in university. I'm thinking, these guys were doing opium. They were promoting opium usage. It was, like we talked about a few weeks ago, it was sort of like a counterpart to the jazz era. It wasn't done through jazz, but it was done through this sort of pagan Renaissance, something or other. And they were suppressing the church in academia to the point where, the Bolshevik-minded people would go into schools and they would uncatechize the children and so forth. It was a time where marriages were breaking down because adultery and open marriages were being promoted. It was a complete and utter abomination. It was an abomination of society. And I'll be honest with you, it was all of these revolutionaries, every single one of them is a pervert. And Michael Jones talks about this with the Marquis de Sade and the French Revolution and so forth. Every revolution has with it sexual perversion, degeneracy, pornography, etc. And this one was no different. And they were extremely evil. They were so evil, these Republicans. Like, this is one of the reasons why they suppress the truth about this, is because the liberals know that there's such thing as just war. This is why they have to make up their own history so they can justify their revolutions as being a just war. They know that there is a just war. And when you look at what the Republicans were doing in Spain, it was disgusting. They were burning priests and nuns alive in churches and so forth. Like, they were as demonic and evil. And when Franco came in and cleaned the house, people say, oh, he was too ruthless. Honestly, if you study word for word what happened, I'm sure obviously the individual soldiers and stuff made some mistakes. That always happens.
Yes.
But when you look at it was an exorcism. It was an exorcism of devils from a country. And you can't reason with devils. And it was a complete societal collapse. And the only way that it could have been done was how it was done.
Yeah, this is another and very important thing, because it'll be crucial when we talk about Vatican II, because the Marxists are so demonic. And so, by the way, so this is where militarily the American Empire and the Soviet Empire are both uniting to support these evil Republicans side who are burning the priests in the churches.
Yeah,
they're being supported militarily, financially. Tanks, guns, even volunteers. There's the American Brigade of Communists that are fighting
Canadian
against
too.
Canadian.
It was the international whatever they were.
So this is kind of where the mask comes off a little bit, even though it's so obscured still by all this false history. The American Empire and the Soviet Empire both support these evil, demonic Republicans, killing all of these martyrs that we venerate today. Are being supported by the American Soviet Empire. So,
and Canadian.
Canadian.
We sent like 1,000 soldiers, volunteers.
There we go. So so this is going to be crucial, because Franco is going to insist that we have to be strict with the communists, because he knows what they're capable of. We have to be strict. We have to be strong against them, or they'll take over. And he keeps on insisting this. But through the influence of Vatican II and Paul VI, and after Franco dies, of course, there is a surrendering, and we'll see what happens in Spain after that, lamentably.
You know that
because Franco was right about the communists.
He was. And just a side note, you know that Canadian Protestant pastor with the Polish accent who's been all over the news, and he was screaming at the police to get out? Did you see that? Yeah,
I didn't see the video. Yeah, but go ahead.
So he's been on like the First, that right wing station in the States with Jesse Kelly. And anyway, he I wish he was a Catholic priest, but he grew up in Poland, and they escaped to Greece, and then they came to Canada. And people who like, he's been so against what's been happening in Canada to the point where people are like, dude, calm. Like normal people are kind of like, calm down. You sound crazy, because he's like, you're Gestapo, you're Nazis, you're communists, you're unfortunately
he's seeing the same thing.
Yeah, but he's like visceral about it. You see it in his face, and he screams and stuff. People are like, why are you so angry? He's like, you don't understand.
Nope.
You don't understand. You don't understand the bodies and the blood and the carnage and the whatever. He saw it, and that's why he's standing up against it.
Yeah, I was just listening to, shout out to Catholic Family News. I was listening to Matt Gaspers and Brian McCall over there, and they were mentioning how Bishop Athanasius Snyder, who lived under communism for decades, he saw how the Gestapo switched to the dictatorship of the gender ideology in Europe. And he said, wow, this is worse than the Soviets. So it's when you have that perspective and you conceive, lived under Soviets, you see how they work, and you see the same thing happening today. Anyways, we got to talk about Germany in the beginning of World War II. So what's happening in Germany during all this time? Okay, so I want to set the context here very clearly, because it's such a dicey issue that's been so politicized. It's so frustrating. We can't even talk about the truth. It's so frustrating. So this is what's happening. So since the since really 1800, before this time, really quickly, and I don't know if I've covered this clearly, so I'm going to try to break this down really quickly. Before this time, there was sort of a public charter. There was a sort of modus vivendi between Jews and Christians. Okay, there was a modus vivendi, meaning the Jews. This is the modus vivendi, wasn't always practiced by either side. But here's the modus vivendi: is that the Jews had a protected space where they could just be Jews. They could practice their Jewish religion. They could do whatever they wanted to do, be Jews in their space, and be protected from mobs of men who profane the name of Christian, killing them. Okay. And that's been since Gregory the Great. That was centuries and centuries old. And many Jews actually liked the so-called ghetto because they wanted to actually resist conversion to Christianity. They wanted to have a ghetto so they could continue to be Jews, but there were other Jews who didn't want the ghetto. They wanted to go out and be capitalists and make a bunch of money. And if you read my book, I've documented this from Jewish sources. They talk about there's basically this 5% elite Jews, this very tiny elite group of Jews who represents like 5% of all Jews. Okay. They're the ones who become the bankers, and they're into Kabbalah and magic and all this nonsense. And they're the ones who are promoting sexual revolution and all this terror. Those are the Jews doing that. Now, keep in mind, that's 5% of all Jews. So, your Jew on the street, whatever, he's probably not involved with any of this. But what happens is there's this strong hatred of Jews, which begins to crescendo by 1900. So in 1890, Civiltà Cattolica of Jesuits says that, I'm not going to quote this exactly right, but what they say Europe is in the grips of a sad question, which in the next century could have calamitous consequences. This is what they say in 1890, because they already see what's happening here. They see that Christianity has lost. These people are losing Christianity. And when you lose Christianity, you are provoked to hatred. You can't even love your neighbor. You can't have any sort of, you can't love and protect even a Jew from any brutality. You just hate. And then further, you take 5% of Jews who are actually doing something wrong, and then you say, well, all Jews are evil. Okay, well, everybody has evil actors, but you can't just say everybody is evil. Now, there's other factors. We can't get into all the different factors about the Jews because it's a complex topic. And unfortunately, we can't do more justice to this. But suffice it to say that there were bad actor Jews. Okay, let's admit that. There were Jews who were totally, doing, they were living fine with society. They weren't doing any wrong. The greatest Jew of this period was a German Jewess named Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross.
Yeah.
Edith Stein. Yeah. She was, in my opinion, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. Yeah. She became a Catholic, and she wrote some of the greatest philosophical works, in my opinion, which are still underrated to this day. And so it's just a complete and Saint Maximilian Kolbe, he's a perfect example of this, because he's fighting against the Jews who are promoting sexual revolution, and then he's also sheltering the Jews from all this terrible eugenics. So what you have is, in Germany, you have this strong reaction to the Jews, which is already happening, but it gets promoted by a pagan whose name is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is not a fascist. He's a pagan.
He's not a fascist. He
is trying to restore the pagan German heritage. He's trying to glory in this pagan past that he's inventing.
Viking lore and all that.
Viking and all that nonsense. So he's not even the fascist. The fascist,
not even not the good Viking, not the Catholic Viking, like Leif Erikson, who discovered Eastern Canada. So go on.
So basically, he's trying to do this. Then he's influenced by the American eugenics, where in the American Empire, 12 half a dozen states imposed mutilation on their people. This is another key point. The American Empire was imposing mutilation, which is sterilization. So they were forcing sterilization on people in the American Empire.
So it was in Canada,
which helped inspire Adolf Hitler for what he was doing, and the whole eugenics movement, which is just Darwinism. Once again, it's evolution. So it's all about this false racial theory where the Germans are this pure blood and all this nonsense. And so he's pushing his racial theory. This is in the 1920s. So you have the Nazi party in the 1920s. They're just thugs. And they're fighting against the communists, who are also thugs. And they're just killing people in the street. And they're just gangs. They're just these thugs. And they're promoting their nonsense pagan theory. Now, one man recognizes immediately the threat of the Nazis, because some people are just like, oh, these guys are idiots. But one man understands more than everybody else the destructive character of the Nazis, and that is the doctor of the church in the 20th century, Dietrich von Hildebrand. He converts in 1914. He's the other greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and he sees it immediately. Now, the Catholic bishops actually excommunicate in the 1920s. The Catholic bishops excommunicated any Catholic who joined the Nazi party. It was a standing excommunication on any Catholic who joined the party. So that needs to be understood, that there was a Catholic opposition to the Nazis immediately. Okay. Now, the Nazis finally are able to maneuver their way into taking power in 1933. And now at that point, Dietrich von Hildebrand is famous across Europe. He's going across, and you need to go read Soul of a Lion by his widow, Alice von Hildebrand, to get the story here. So he is famous throughout Italy, or famous throughout Europe. He speaks multiple languages, and he's giving talks everywhere, So he knows immediately that the Nazis are going to come and assassinate him. So he has a choice. He's got a wife and a son. He can either lift his voice and continue to speak in Germany, and then he'll just be assassinated, or he'll just stay quiet. And so he decides that he needs to take his wife and son and flee and go to Austria, where he hooks up with the fascist Engelbert Dollfuss of Dollfuss, I believe it's pronounced Dollfuss in Austria. So here's another
who was anti-Hitler, who was anti-Nazi.
This is the point. This is what breaks up this dumb fascist. Even today, lamentably, I'm reading this. This guy more than anybody should understand the difference between fascism and Nazism. But Seewald writes in his book that Nazism is fascism. But Dollfuss is a fascist who funds Dietrich von Hildebrand to write his newspaper, which is called the Christian Corporate State, which is a German anti-Nazi newspaper that is being published in Germany or in Austria. And so the situation in Austria needs to be understood, so we understand the start of World War II. So in Austria, there is a great deal of Nazi sympathizers or Nazi party members in Austria, and they're trying to promote Nazism. So Adolf Hitler has taken over in Germany in 1933. He's imposing his will on everything and doing. Joseph Ratzinger will soon be forced into the Hitler Youth and forced to be a anti-aircraft assistant when he's 14, 15, 16 during World War II. So Dietrich von Hildebrand also, so he's fighting against the Nazis in word, in newspaper. He's just dismantling there. And what's great about this newspaper is that it totally dismantles communism and totally dismantles Nazism, because some people think that the only way to, in Germany, some people think that the only way to counter communism is to become a Nazi.
Yeah.
And he's showing that these are both evil ideologies.
Let's explain the appeal, though, for people. Why is that the case? Because you're thinking to yourself, well, how can you be so insane that you would join Nazis and to be an anti-communist if Nazism is also insane?
That's a good point. Good point.
Reality, the thing is, what we see, but we're seeing fallen man react to the fall of Christendom. And what you were saying about the protection of the Jews, for example, in a Christian society, the word ghetto is an Italian word. It doesn't mean poor. It just means an area for an ethnic group, essentially. So that could be quite a flourishing, rich area if the culture is like that. And that's what you saw anyway. And it could be bad. No one's excusing the atrocities or anything, or even not just the atrocities. No one's excusing misstep and discrimination. No one's whatever. But the reality is that it's like with all things, it's a complicated past. History. Coulomb always says this, they'll say, was this guy a good guy or a bad guy? And he's like, he was a human being. So it depends on which biography you read. And that's true. And that'll be the same of all of our lives. That'll be the same of all of our lives. And we have to remember that when we're looking at history, we're looking at our ancestors, for better or for worse. And we should give them the benefit of the doubt when trying to understand why they did what they did. So why would, what was happening in Germany, etc.? Well, when Christendom goes away, and Germany was already fractured so much because it had been split by Protestantism and Catholicism. The problems there. When Christendom goes away, you have to rely on some sort of national identity if you want some sort of national movement. And you're coming out of World War I, and it's fall of Christendom and the Depression, and Germany was hit as hard as anybody by the economic problems. You're going to the grocery store with a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. It was totally nonsense. So you appeal to a nationalist sensibility in a place that's lost its Catholic faith. Which means you appeal to what? You appeal to this folklore, this Viking, this basically paganism. Okay, the reality is communism is atheistic. Okay, so people aren't atheists. People are, Chesterton says this. Atheism says atheism is not the natural state of fallen man. The natural state of fallen man is pantheism, is polytheism, is Greek mythology. That's why we see all pre-Christian states are pantheist states. Okay, so Germany is basically appealing to that natural sensibility where man, and you see that today. You see that today with why do men think men like Joe Rogan, etc. Because they're not atheists. They're anti-Christian or whatever, but they're not atheists. They're all about the power of the self and the new myth today is Darwinianism, which is just a pagan myth in a sense. And Hitler was appealing to that, which is, if you're faced with Nazism, which is a hard sell, or communism, which is a hard sell to the masses because it requires austerity, because communism is saying we're going to all be equal and have austerity. That's not fun unless you basically force people to do it. And you can't sell that in a German society at that time, because Germany was economically and culturally one of the greatest on earth before the First World War, as far as their influence. So you're saying you're not going to sell that where they're like industrializing, everyone's working in a factory. They basically have this like steely, weird communist stoicism. You're not going to sell us that. What you can sell us is we're the superior race and we deserve all the nice things. And as a result of that, we should be, the highest of civilization because of our German blood. That's easy to sell to fallen man. So that's what's going on right there. Both of those will lead eventually to terrible errors. In a sense, Nazism is Freemasonry, if you think about it all the way through, because it is not atheistic. It is still spiritual. And it still is it's Gnostic, in that way, and that's what Freemasonry ultimately is, versus the Marxism, which is essentially just atheist materialism. So that's kind of the context. So when you look back, you go, how would they all fall into this? It's not much different than American exceptionalism. If you think about the myth of like Mormonism is kind of a non-violent version of the Gnostic Nazism that you see, insofar as this is the myth of our people, and we're special, and we've been chosen by God or the gods or whatever, and we should be rich and powerful and so forth. And you see that all over the world today. Nazism was just an example of that. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so the nuncio to Germany in the 1920s is Eugenio Pacelli. Eugenio Pacelli speaks fluent German. During his papal court when he was pope, the language that they spoke in the papal court was German. His right hand man was actually a woman, Madre Pascalina. So she was and she was a Bavarian nun. What was that?
She was Bavarian.
So she's German. Pacelli speaks German. They're just speaking German in the papal court in Rome. That's during his pontificate. So he says, I don't know when he said it, but he thinks that Nazism is the greatest heresy ever at this time. But they realized that the church first in 1933, when Hitler comes to power, tries to sign a Concordat with Hitler to protect the church. This is what needs to be understood. I was taught in university. This is the type of propaganda you get.
Whatever. Yeah.
In university, they think a Concordat is like, oh, we're gonna just play ball with Hitler and let him do his thing. That's not what a Concordat is. A Concordat is trying to protect the church from a possibly evil force. But Eugenio Pacelli at the time thought that even though he knew how bad it was, he thought that this might actually protect the church. He was wrong, because immediately the Hitler just began to disregard the Concordat and suppress the church. Dietrich von Hildebrand was totally against it. He thought it was a terrible move. It was confusing the faithful as well. Even at that time, it was confusing the faithful, because what happened after Hitler took power is that the Catholic bishops of Germany then got soft. That's when they lifted the excommunication, because they realized that, people are just this is the tough part too, because if you be strict with Hitler, we know that there's going to be blood in the streets. So you could be strict. You could enforce that excommunication. You could, and then they would just be drug out of their homes and shot in the streets. And we know that to be the case because they've been doing that for years now. And so that's the hard part as a churchman. Because you're responsible for their souls. Should you enforce the excommunication and then have blood on your hands, quote unquote? Maybe this is what they're thinking. Should I enforce the excommunication? Then these Catholic families are drug out in the street and killed. Should I enforce that? Or should I lift the excommunication and then try to oppose him by other means? This is the difficulty of war. This is why people should not judge strictly people who make bad decisions. Like we'll talk about Pétain in World War II and his bad decision, quote unquote. We need to realize that this is wartime, and it's sometimes you're in a situation where you've got two bad decisions. You have to make one, or two negative consequences. You have to make one of them.
This is why I was thinking about this yesterday. This is why the Vatican, the church needs an army. Like, honestly, historically, why does the church have military forces, either their own, or this is why the papal state's being taken? We could go back even further. That was the War of Prussia, basically. But this, that era. This is why you need to have a military, because these serial murderers, it's funny, they're not usually very reasonable. So they don't respond to anything but force. So the tenets of what's a just action as a Catholic. It's kind of like what we're going through now. I was asked by a priest, could you guys have some sort of Cristero rebellion up in Canada? I'm like, no, there's no way we could justify it, because even if you got 1,000 guys together, you'd all be decimated and anyway, it's just like there's no possible way to justify any rebellion, because there's no chance of winning. And there was no chance of winning in Germany for the Catholics. There was a chance of winning in Spain. There was a chance of winning in Portugal. Happily happened bloodlessly, and there was a chance of winning in Italy. And Mexico, there was a chance of winning, which is why it was allowed to happen. So, but when you take away the power of a Catholic state, which acts as the Pope's army, and you take away the actual papal states, which actually have their own armies, you see the fall of Christendom. And if man will not listen to the threat of eternal damnation, he's not going to listen to anything.
Yes. So we got to wrap up here. So there's a few crucial points here. And so Dollfuss is a pious Catholic. He's funding the anti-Nazi. He's a pious Catholic fascist.
Mm-hmm.
Trigger alert. So he's a pious Catholic fascist funding the anti-Catholic Nazi newspaper of Dietrich von Hildebrand. Dietrich von Hildebrand is also he meets with Blessed Charles' widow, the Empress, and the Habsburg, and he's trying to. Dietrich von Hildebrand is actually a monarchist, and he's trying to form alliances with the monarchist parties who are still in abeyance, trying to support fascism. Maybe they're not so sure about fascism, but he is. So he's just dismantling, and he's German through and through, and just dismantling everything in German. So he's destroying Nazism. Well, what happens? The Nazis break in and assassinate Dollfuss in 1934. So Dietrich von Hildebrand knows that he's next. Mm-hmm. So he's always he is in Austria, always looking over his shoulder. There's people giving him threats all the time. So this is 1934 to 1938. So the next 4 years, he stays in Austria and continues to fight against the Nazis with his anti-Nazi newspaper. Meanwhile, the foreign minister to Austria, Nazi foreign minister, says that Dietrich von Hildebrand is public enemy number one.
Yeah,
because he's the greatest German Catholic at this time, just destroying Nazism one by one with his newspaper. And so he's helping the Catholics, supporting them to fight against Nazism. And finally, in 1937, through the influence of Eugenio Pacelli, who's now the Secretary of State to Pius XI. So now this is where Pius XI really shines as a great pope in 1937. So 1937, he produces one of his greatest encyclicals, which is Divini Redemptoris, in 1937, which condemns communism. This is one of the greatest acts. I love this story because in 1937, they published the anti-communist encyclical. And what happens is the Nazis praise it. They're thinking, wow, they hate the communists. These Catholics are wonderful. And in Divini Redemptoris, there's this great line that says, nothing that is not built upon Jesus Christ, the solid rock, will crumble. Mm-hmm. And so he's talking about communism. Can't build up something that's not based on Jesus Christ, is going to die. So the Nazis all praise it. Wow, these Catholics are great. They're anti-communist. Well, the very next week, the first and last ever German encyclical, Mit Brenner, is smuggled into Germany, which is a German condemnation of Nazism, which is written very much by Eugenio Pacelli, Pius XII. And Mit Brenner is then, the Pope orders this encyclical or the basics of it to be read from every single pulpit in Nazi Germany. And so the church is done playing games. The church has tried. We've tried to work with Germany. It's clear that Hitler is going to just kill everybody. And now it's kind of like we're going to have to go to martyrdom at this point.
Yeah.
And so this is such a bold move because we need to understand. So Nazism is condemned at every Catholic pulpit. So anybody who lies and says, "Oh, the Catholic Church was soft on Nazism," not true at all. Not true in the slightest. In fact, this is one of the times when the church really shines because the church says, church condemns Nazism on every single pulpit, knowing that they will all die, and they do, because immediately Hitler targets the church more than ever and just starts destroying the Catholic Church. Sending priests to Dachau and Auschwitz and just. This is where the martyrs come forth. And this is what makes Dietrich von Hildebrand write later that our era is so great because of so many saints and martyrs. And this is what really shines. And this is St. Teresa Benedicta, I think the greatest German martyr of this time. She, as a Jewish Catholic, she says, she makes a vow to God to accept the cross, whatever it may be. And she accepts the cross. She says, on behalf of the Jewish people, for the conversion of the Jewish people, and for the peace of God and for reparation. She takes it all like a saint.
Yep.
And she's pulled out of the monastery with her sister Rosa. At this time she's in the Netherlands. She's pulled out and she accepts the cross. And all the witnesses seeing her observe her total peaceful, prayerful demeanor as she boards the train to Auschwitz and is immediately gassed. She is such a great saint of this period. And also we have St. Maximilian Kolbe as well. He received the call in Poland. He received the call that he was going to Auschwitz, and he put the phone down and said, "Yes, Mary." I love that. He gets on the train, and then he starts singing Polish songs of patriotic and Marian songs on the train to Auschwitz. He gets to Auschwitz, and we know the story.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, we'll have to put that on hold for World War II. But so what happens here is 1937. They target the church, and now they go after Dietrich von Hildebrand to take over Austria. Mm-hmm. And this is the key. So at this point, January 1938, and this is when the sign comes from heaven.
Yes,
we have this crazy aurora borealis,
and that's prophesied in Fatima.
So back in Fatima, it said there will be a sign from heaven showing that there will be
a great light.
Yes, so the great light from heaven will be the sign that
the next war is starting.
The next war will start.
Yeah.
If I am not heeded, if God is not heeded, and God is not his wrath is not appeased by penance. And this will be the sign from heaven. So this was, and Marshall quotes this in his book, and he mentioned he looked up the New York Times article from 1938, and the New York Times article says that people in England and as far as Italy never sees the aurora borealis. This is something that's in you guys see it in where you're at?
Yeah. You
okay. Yeah. So you can see it in Canada. You have to be far more north. If you haven't heard of the aurora borealis, you can look it up. The Northern Lights. You can look up the Northern Lights. For Australian viewers, I don't know if you've heard of that. Maybe you have it in the Southern Hemisphere. I don't know. But so the Northern Lights, some kind of Northern Lights happen. And it's seen as far as Italy, which is just shocking. That's never happens. Yeah. And people literally think that the houses are on fire. And they start calling the fire department. This is this is a big sign. This was in the news. This was in the New York Times. So it's a sign. This is the sign from heaven, January 1938. Now, what happens? Hitler is pushing to take Austria. The chancellor who had replaced Dollfuss is rather compliant to the Nazis. He's weak, but he says, I can't let you in unless I give it a full referendum of the Austrian people. We have to have a full vote. All the Austrians have to vote to allow the Nazis in or not. And Hitler says, okay, thanks, bye. Next day, he comes in with his tanks. Before the referendum, I don't know if it's the next day, but before the referendum happened, there was no referendum. This was an invasion of Austria. It is falsely
basically the beginning of the war.
It is falsely called the annexation of Russia, or the annexation of Austria, because there were Nazis in Austria. Okay, there were Nazis in Austria, but he came in with his tanks without an invitation and took over. That's called an invasion. Just because there weren't shots fired, that's an invasion. And they went straight for Dietrich von Hildebrand's house that very night. They came at 3 a.m. They knew all his hiding spots. They had already studied the layout of his apartment. They had gone everywhere, and Dietrich von Hildebrand had to take the last train out of Austria with his wife to flee the Nazis, and he, by God's providence, fled the Nazis. But this is why, in my opinion, I don't know if you agree. Well, tell me if you agree, Kennedy. This is why I think that the prophecy was fulfilled from Fatima, which says that the war will begin under Pius XI, because this was March 1938. I
believe that. Yeah.
Okay, so Pius XI dies, I think,
39,
early 1939. So the false history says, World War II didn't start until the invasion of Poland.
You see the liberal revisionist history. It's anti-Catholic because it literally goes against Catholic prophecy.
It goes against Catholic prophecy. So clearly, and it's unfortunately, I see Catholics talk about this and they're like, well, they try to explain it some way because they accept the premise that World War II happened with the invasion of Poland. Mm-hmm. But I think that when tanks roll in uninvited and take over, I think that's an invasion. I think that's a declaration of war, in my opinion. But the problem is immediately Hitler starts. This is what really is crazy about World War II is that Hitler just starts taking over uninvited or pressuring people with his tanks. He's taken over more, not just Austria. He starts taking over other places, and France, Germany, or France, England, they just sort of say, okay, let's sign a treaty and just let you have your land.
Yeah.
That's what they do for the next few years.
But it's the church that was bad for saying, let's not provoke blood in the streets. But England and France, they're fine because they were tolerant of the Nazis.
Yeah, they were tolerant of the Nazis at this point. Nobody did anything. They signed treaties with Hitler at that point. Mm-hmm. Let's just let them go because they were the heroes at the end.
Yeah. Time Magazine, Man of the Year. Yeah.
So this is the false history. So we tried to get it. Did Pius XI cause the current crisis by not consecrating Russia? Had he consecrated Russia, World War II would not have happened, presumably. So if you would have consecrated Russia, there would not have been World War II. And World War II is really what really causes Vatican II. And we'll talk about that in the time, because World War II is what destroys and discredits the only Catholic movement, basically, was just fascism and Catholic action. And we haven't talked about other, like even the Catholic movement in America, the Legion of Decency, it destroys that too.
Yep.
And
it destroys Quebec.
Everything is falsely branded as fascist, which isn't even close to fascism, like Nazism. And even to this day, we have Antifa, who brands anything Catholic as fascist. We're still living with that legacy.
It killed Quebec too. The movement underneath Duplessis.
Yep. So we have to wrap up here. We've gone a little bit over to try to get through this history before. So next week, stay tuned. We're going to debate. We'll have to talk about
World War II, and we're going to debate.
So next week we will talk about World War II, and we'll debate whether Pius XII did the consecration. I will argue that he did. Kennedy will argue that he did not, and we'll talk about that, especially in regards to the era of Russia. So let's offer up a Pater Noster for the consecration of Russia.
Wait, that hadn't happened.
I mean, it did happen, but more consecration and conversion of Russia. I mean,
okay, good.
I should just change my whole demeanor. Consecration of Russia did happen. Now we want the full conversion of Russia to the Catholic faith.
Okay.
Most of all, we want the errors of Russia destroyed and Marxism overthrown, and every other evil conspiracy that we've tried to explain is all one conspiracy, the fallen angels.
Yeah.
Let me get my resurrection icon here, and we'll offer up that, and we'll close out the 4th week of Easter. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Christ is risen.
Risen indeed.